Hello, everyone. Hello again to those of you who were here this afternoon. And I have to say, Miriam, thank you. This is the first time I've been referred to as a godmother of feminist economics. So I feel very happy about that. That's very cool. But it also put to mind the importance, right, of the sort of the intellectual help that we get and the shoulders on which we stand. And so I'm very honored to be sitting next to Diane Elson here today, but also to see out in the audience many people who were essential to bringing me to where I am today in terms of how I think about macroeconomics. And that issue of world development, the second issue in 2000, was one that I contributed to as a graduate student. And so I got to work with Karen and Diane and Nilofer Chatai, and who very much put me on the pathway that I am today. So these are my godmothers, and thank you very much for that. So I'm talking about incorporating care in economic models, a mostly macro agenda. For those of you who are here this afternoon too, I feel a little vulgar about this, but I'm going to proceed in the sense of talking about economic growth and in the world of sort of macroeconomic modeling. And you'll see many shades of the talk that Diane put forward, and I see this as very much a manifestation of the kinds of insights and directions that my foremothers gave to me. So I'm very much thinking about moving beyond just sort of gender disaggregating, which I think of as part of this adding women in stir approach, that you kind of differentiate between women and men and perhaps other genders, but the rest of the model is essentially the same. So I'm talking about transforming economic theory, and in particular thinking about the question of what. I know Özlem is going to be talking about why. And I actually thought that I might go after you, but I'm going before you. I think. So you'll see here, and this is when I thought that I would go after Özlem. But building on I think, you can go either way, building on our panel's overview, right? Thinking about 30 years of history and breaking the silence, and we'll be talking about why we need gendered models. And I'm going to be thinking about concrete frameworks for transformation. I feel like we have theoretical tools and increasingly an empirical foundation and opportunities to fundamentally restructure macroeconomic models and really pressing to actually do the work. So I have to pause here, and we talked a little bit about this in the last session. Why model at all? And this is a feminist dilemma, but I also think it's an opportunity. There's a lot of historical skepticism, and I think well-deserved, in feminist economics around the exclusionary effects of mathematical formalism. Being abstract and complicated for the sake of being abstract and complicated, without much insight. There's also historical skepticism that is born out of acknowledging the importance that we need a diversity of knowledge creation and not all to use the same tools. And especially using those tools as a sort of form of gatekeeping, which we talked about in the last session as well. And the struggle that feminist economists have with the complexity of our lived experiences and the realities that we face every day versus, the press towards a certain abstract simplification of elegant equations that work together. I think another part of why it's been challenging to get feminist economic models is because of the rise of empirics, which has really affected feminist economics as much as it has the mainstream. We know from some work from Shiba Tijani and Sarah Small that within feminist economics itself, empirical analysis is the dominant sort of tool of the trade. And to some extent, unfortunately, I think this has left some of the work on the theoretical foundation making behind, you know? And in that sense, I really do believe in this sort of revolutionary potential of modeling, because I see it as helping us to structure and think about our theoretical foundations. And this is because, you know, when you engage with modeling, you are revealing hidden assumptions, like the ones that Diane talked about in terms of assuming unlimited supplies of labor. You are tasked with really specifying causal mechanisms and producing testable hypotheses, challenging policy narratives, and creating new possibilities. So in all of these senses, one of the reasons that I like the struggle with models is because it makes the invisible visible and the implicit explicit. Although I have to acknowledge, right, for any of you have read, you know, which all of you have, like DSGE models and things like that. I mean, nobody knows what's going on in a lot of those models. But, you know, in that sense, I think that that's where a feminist sensibility can really help you do good work in this area, because I think it's essential for you to have to explain what's going on intuitively and to understand what's really happening inside the model. So my example of models as revolutionary tools is what Diane was talking about in terms of feminist insights into structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s, and how it revealed the hidden assumption of unlimited supplies of women's unpaid labor, and how this sort of false efficiency actually depleted capabilities and in the longer time undermined the goals of the models themselves. And, you know, even though this may seem implicitly or obvious to many of us who think about these issues, it was really a revolutionary sort of uncovering, I think, in relation to the assumptions of these models. So thank you for that. Whoops, yeah. So I'm going to now talk about the what more specifically. And I'm going to start with some challenges, some practical challenges that relate to integration. And Diane talked about some of these. I'm organizing them in a way that I think about macroeconomic models. So one has to do with reconceptualizing economic fundamentals, and importantly, and Diane talked about this, seeing GDP as a means, not an end. Right, so the traditional view is that GDP growth will implicitly bring about development success, but a capability-centered view, GDP growth and its drivers like investment and consumption and trade have results for human capabilities. Now, I'm talking about doing more than saying that, but I'm talking about what does it actually mean, or how can we sort of shift our model so that, you know, GDP growth is no longer the dependent variable, right? But it's one of the, it's on the right-hand side of the equation. It's not an independent variable, but, right, it's there because we're looking at human capabilities. So in that sense, policy evaluation depends on its impact on capabilities and distribution and sustainability. And it's the level and structure and the distribution and pace of economic growth. Now, some of you who know my work know that I've done some of this type of work, but with GDP growth as the dependent variable. It's a lot to switch the framework and have it be on the interior, but I think it's essential to go that next step. We also know, as Diane talked about in terms of time use studies, that we're missing a lot when we just talk about GDP. There have been calls for satellite accounts that include household production. So, for instance, in the OECD, between a third to a half of total economic activity is constituted by estimates of household production. So it's not that it's this sort of satellite thing happening over there, but it's actually part of economic activity. So there's this difference between what we measure and what we miss. It's not just about identifying what we measure and what we miss, but also identifying the policy implications of that, of missing it, because economic policies based on partial data lead to partial solutions. So the second element that I want to talk about in terms of integration challenges is reformulating some of the economic variables and relationships. So one that Diane also referenced was valuing human capabilities or human capacities as investment and really extending the investment concept beyond its traditional guise of physical capital and technological innovation. Neoclassical economists in particular have incorporated elements of human capital. I think that that's important, but also to understand that investment, to understand and to model explicitly and intentionally human capabilities, meaning health and well-being and care provisioning, social cohesion, agency and freedom, from the perspective of that these capabilities, they have both intrinsic value and instrumental returns. And it's important to acknowledge both. So another example here, and I think Özlem will be talking about some of these, is gender-aware fiscal multipliers, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I think this is really interesting work that how different kinds of spending on social infrastructure versus physical infrastructure, and that social infrastructure spending actually has larger fiscal multipliers in the sense of generating greater employment and tax revenue. And I think this is a really important aspect of the macroeconomic agenda. So the third thing that I want to talk about in terms of integration challenges is thinking about care as a production process and grappling directly with the questions of quality, complementarity, and substitutability. Diane talked a little bit about the limits of substitutability, and I think that's important to acknowledge. But I also think, I also think that we could really benefit from more sort of macro model-based analysis of substitutability, and I'll talk about what I mean. So if we think about care provisioning as a production process, it has a set of inputs, time, commodities, infrastructure, institutions, norms, and social organizations. There's a care process that uses these inputs. Quality is really important, as is context. It's relational, non-separable, and time-intensive. And in terms of outputs, we have human capabilities, well-being, social cohesion, but also productive capacity. And one of the things that is important to acknowledge, and I know Sue Himmelwhite is here. She's been really, she helped me, her work has helped me really understand this, that unlike widgets, care quality cannot be separated from the process of provision. So in terms of thinking about care as a production process, we have to incorporate that element. We can't just sort of add care to standard production models and go from there. There's also a challenge around quality in thinking about this. There are some quantity trade-offs in terms of thinking about care, time per care recipient, emotional availability, customization versus standardization, relational continuity. These all can be important. There are clear policy tensions, efficiency in terms of how much care are you providing relative to inputs versus measuring effectiveness. How do you do that? Cost containment versus quality, scale versus personalization. Diane also talked about productivity metrics. In some of the macro modeling that I've done, quality can depend on time intensity, skill, compensation. Better paid care workers typically provide, you have sort of care motivations, but also it's good to be paid well for the job that you're doing. Continuity and emotional connection also have impacts on quality. So I talked about quality in terms of integration challenges, but it's also important to think about and unpack substitutability and complementarity in the context of macro models. To what extent can the market, the state, or the community replace family care? Maybe substitutability is high, and I'm thinking, a factor, a numerical factor that can rate substitutability in routine physical care or standardized education, basic health services. Maybe it's not so high in terms of cultural transmission or emotional support, though I do get, I really love my paid psychotherapist. So, right? I mean, substitutability, maybe that's more complementary. The differences between these depend on working conditions and the needs of the care recipient, the skills of the provider in larger social contexts. I also think it's important, right, to specify complementarity. Goods and services can make care more effective or efficient. So examples, I cared for someone recently who was recovering from a very serious surgery, and we had nutritional products delivered to the house, which made caring for that person a lot easier than otherwise. They would have had to stay in the hospital. But also services like drop-in care or senior daycare centers can be thought of as complementary, right, to family care, and ways that marketization or the involvement of money in these relationships, right, can make family care more effective and even, efficient. I also, at a macro conference, it's important, I think, to address micro foundations. We talked about this also in the last section. How much time do I have? Sorry, I wasn't. Okay, good. Okay. So I call this the micro foundations challenge, right? One of the essential pieces, especially from a macro perspective, to talk about relative to care is that it's a public good. And that's something I think that micro foundations can really miss. And it's important to engage directly with that. But there are a lot of contributions that I think micro foundational types of models have made at the same time. Household heterogeneity matters. It gives you an anchor on which to situate how power, choice, and conflict work out, so we can have diverse household types and intra-household bargaining, life cycle dynamics and intergenerational relationships, and also how class, gender, and race and ethnicity play out, these intersections. But, there's also, decreasing returns in some way. Maybe they're increasing and then decreasing. You can get into this tractability problem where you have this model that is so complex, you don't even know how it really, you don't even understand how it really works. Computational complexity can mean it's really difficult to apply it to different situations, or you need a tremendous amount of data to do it. Parameters proliferate, and it's not reasonable anymore to estimate so many of them, and you can lose intuition. But I think there are solutions here. I believe in strategic simplification, preserving key insights while maintaining analytical power. And I think we can move beyond representative agents in interesting ways in terms of grappling with issues like stratified reproduction, global care chains, how care is differentiated, or the quality of care across class, and the ways that these stratified relationships can reproduce inequality. But agent-based models are also interesting in the sense that they can reveal emergent social patterns and network effects and how different norms are transmitted, as well as adaptive behavior. So in this sense, I really am advocating for a sort of methodological pluralism. Different questions require different tools, and I find some of the best to be hybrid versions of things, of models. So I encourage you to explore and experiment. And in my last few minutes, I'm going to talk about dynamic considerations. A big issue here that I think we should grapple with is demography and depreciation. Aging societies, which are affecting the world over, despite the, regardless of the level of development, means we have rising care needs, which creates labor force constraints and challenges for economic growth, as well as human capability depreciation. So in terms of policy responses that we've seen among, in international financial institutions that are sort of taking up this question of demographic change, one has been to increase female labor force participation, right, to sustain the size of the workforce relative to dependence, but of course this abstracts from the question of who provides care. Another is to increase the retirement age, but to what extent are there capability limits here, or increasing the productivity of care, through what mechanism would that happen? The last thing I want to talk about is, in terms of dynamics, is the question of development and structural transformation. And many of you know, and I know we're going to have papers on this, but in the modern era, manufacturing has had this important historical role in aggregate productivity growth because of unconditional convergence and economies of scale as well as scope. Manufacturing has really good productivity spillovers and both backward and forward linkages with domestic economies, export potential, which enables you to capture economies of scale, and also this formal employment generation, which enables a larger share of the workforce to participate in the positives of economic growth through higher wages. But as many of you also know, that with technological innovation and ongoing globalization, that manufacturing is not the employment generator it once was. So there's an emerging discussion around services and its potential and limits as a deliverer of growth. High-value segments of services like IT and finance don't produce a lot of employment. It has limited tradability, and this cost disease issue where care costs tend to rise over time relative to other sectors. And of course, this quality productivity tension. And I think India is a really good example, or a cautionary tale, where you get high GDP growth, but insufficient quality employment generation, and inequality increases. So there's a paradox in the sense that care is essential for capabilities, but challenging for conventional productivity metrics. There are ways to resolve this productivity paradox, and I think feminist economists are doing really good, really interesting job, and we'll hear more about this, but I think it's a really pressing development question to grapple with this in terms of incorporating and specifying the long-term capability returns of investing in care services. So care investment pays off over generations. How do we incorporate this in models and policy, as well as connecting care sector wages to social value? Okay, this is my last slide. So key takeaways. So I'm just sort of summarizing what I already talked about. Care is both intrinsically valuable and instrumentally critical. The social organization of care shapes all macroeconomic outcomes. And I think we can't address 21st century challenges, including ecological sustainability, without a care lens. I didn't get to talk about that. And so it's not just about adding variables to economic models, but about transforming how we understand economic systems. Thank you. Oh, that's it.